Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 51st episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'll actually just do a quick follow up to the previous episode. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see it. It's about the natural selection of ideas, where basically I discuss the the fact that perhaps our reality is the sort of mirror reflection of the total number of beliefs that humanity holds at a certain point in time. But there has to be some kind of mechanism for an idea, a thought, or belief to manifest in reality and also the form that it actually takes. So, for instance, because we're still in a 3D materialist science kind of setting, then encounters with UFOs or aliens and that stuff normally doesn't happen on the 3D plane, but happens in other planes, even though you may experience it as something very real. It's just that your consciousness is shifted to another reality, even though you may not have sensed it or felt it. Now, there's one idea that I haven't discussed because one issue is, first of all, to believe that there are some ideas that are good and bad. Like, for instance, those ideas that don't make the cut basically in our reality. Like, for instance, you believing that you're going to fly out of the window like Superman, that's somehow bad because it's not an idea or a belief that you actually get to experience. But that's not really how it goes. First of all, it's not about good or bad. It's about basically you have these different timelines, let's say, that go from the ultimate past to the ultimate future, and some ideas allow you to have a story where you shift between them, and some are actually a kind of a dead end at some point, and you need to move on from them. And so it's not that, for instance, creationism is a bad idea. It's just that it was the belief of humanity at a certain point in time. It got us from, for instance, being animals and believing in animistic gods and whatever to another point, and from that point to another point. So it's just a question of evolution of ideas and shifting consciousness. So just like you would look at, like, dig out the ancestor of a hedgehog, you wouldn't say that that ancestor, the idea or basically the way that that hedgehog functioned at that point was bad and that today's hedgehog is good. You just see this evolutionary kind of pattern. And the second thing that I wanted to discuss is, well, there are three things. So ideas, true versus false. And of course, there are no false ideas. It's just that there are ways of experiencing ideas, certain ideas, and how to attach them to the experience. So, for instance, experiencing certain ideas in a virtual environment, like in VR, for instance, that allows gradually to attach impossible to experience ideas in the 3D in a virtual setting. And the more we sort of learn about how the brain functions in capturing our five senses, the more we'll be able to experience certain ideas without breaking the experience, the overall experience, without completely annihilating reality, which would happen if everybody had superpowers, for instance. And which is why also people, instead of using VR, they can go into the astral or do a how do you call that, like dream, lucid dreams. They can do lucid dreams to experience versus various ideas and wishes and thoughts, because there you break nothing. You don't break the experience or the evolution of the consciousness. You can do whatever you want. You don't mess anything up. So there's no false idea, really. It's just a matter of how you manage to integrate ideas into an experience. And then finally, and this is why I called it ideas mix, is that I wouldn't want you to think that there is an ideal cocktail or an ideal idea, like a perfect idea, like, for instance, our current spiritual understanding of reality in the spiritual circles, with the chakras, with angels, and with all kinds of like higher dimensional beings and dimensions. um, I understand that this way of thinking, this model, this way of understanding the universe, perhaps for humanity, there is an optimal kind of mix of different ideas, different beliefs, which creates an experience which is very rich and diverse and resilient to to well, anyone taking control of it and limiting its the possibilities. So let's say, imagine, like I like to take this example, for instance. Let's say that all the ideas, all the beliefs, all the belief systems of humanity that we hold, for instance, right now, that is monotheism, monotheist, the old religions, science, materialist science, oops, and then the spiritual, and all the different beliefs that humanity holds. Imagine that they're just like the different atoms in the periodic table. So, like, let's say, like hydrogen is monotheism, and oxygen is a science, and then carbon is spiritual beliefs, and then blah blah blah, and iron is Buddhism or whatever. And if you if you have these elements in a certain proportion, in a certain proportion in a certain proportion, like you have a lot of hydrogen, then a little bit less oxygen, and a little bit less like helium here, and you have these in a certain proportions, then you arrive to this very rich universe that we see, very diverse, with a lot of different planets, a lot of different suns, a lot of different experiences available in the world of chemistry. And if you, for instance, had it another way, like for instance, you'd have especially a lot of carbon and almost no hydrogen, very little hydrogen and very little oxygen, maybe in that kind of universe, you'd have a lot less diversity and a lot less opportunity to experience with plenty of different things, plenty of different planets, and it would also lead to a sort of a dead end, because maybe you couldn't go from chemistry to biology, or you couldn't go to more complex experiences from that kind of mix. And so when you see things in that way, then there is no necessity to convert anyone to any specific beliefs. You just have to make sure that if you meet someone that is uncomfortable with the beliefs they have and are inquisitive and curious for changing them, it probably means they've been sort of attracted to you based on the fact that they might be a carbon atom that actually wants to be a hydrogen atom, because for some reason it's not who they really are. They want to be something else, and that's fine. But if somebody is for sort of is repulsed by your beliefs and saying you're totally crazy with your spiritual stuff, it's obvious that only science is the true whatever, blah blah blah. Why would you feel frustrated? Why would you want to convince the oxygen to become the hydrogen? When you see it in that way, then you understand that perhaps this person holding those sets of beliefs is actually somehow extremely important to the cohesion of our own reality, its stability for the experience, for instance, and for the diversity of all possible experiences that we could have as humanity once we ascend. Because if all of us think exactly alike and all of us believe the same thing about reality, that restricts very much the kind of experiences we can have. Whereas, what about all these that are on the fringes? And I like to see that as this fractal. It's the same fractal that I've seen and that I've shown in previous videos about life, for instance, where out of this one living cell that multiplied, you had plants that stemmed out of it, and animals, and that branched off into mammals, reptiles, and the plants branched out into flowers and weeds, and but out of this one cell, all that diversity. But if probably that cell had basically was totally open to, or the subcomponents of that living cell, like the amino acids and protein and whatever, were open to being a lot of different things. Whereas if they only believed that they were a flower, for instance, and then they would just generate this one strand of experience where the entire planet will be covered in flowers, and it might be beautiful, but okay, what about the rest? And so if you view beliefs and ideas in humanity in that sense, is that it's not a question about true or false, it's not a question about good or bad, it's maybe a question of the right mix, which creates the right diversity without breaking the experience. This balance idea, a balance between all ideas, and a mutual respect of these ideas where they sort of fit together in a certain way, which creates this huge diversity. And you can see that in life, for instance, you can see it happening. You can see that you have ecosystems that are created, where you have this whole circle of life, where the plants are eaten by the animals, then some animals eat other animals, and those die and generate compost for plants, and that circle is perfect. It's perfectly in balance. And you know what happens when you put a lot of strain on an ecosystem and bring in some weird species or destroy certain parts of that cycle, then it all stops functioning, and sort of deteriorates really quickly. And by the same token, perhaps that all the ideas and beliefs that humanity holds, somehow it's not about trying to convince people that your way of thinking is the right one. It's just working on your own sets of beliefs to be sure that you're 100% comfortable with yours, because that is the only thing that matters. Once everybody finds the beliefs that they're comfortable with, then perhaps that's when we're ready to ascend, because we found the right mix, the right diversity, the right balance for becoming this kind of stem cell out of which everything, all the diversity of experiences can be generated for humanity. Um, and I'm using always this metaphor of birth, for instance. But do you actually think a stomach cell has the same belief about what is happening to it, what the purpose of its life is, to the cell of the skin? And I don't think they have the same idea about reality, the same beliefs about reality. I mean, the skin cell is in direct contact with the outside, has a totally different experience than the stomach cell, but they kind of respect each other. They respect each other in their respective beliefs, and acknowledge that, okay, you may have that experience. I'm not taking it away from you, but I'm having a different one. And perhaps by just maybe sharing without trying to convince, that is going to be uh, beneficial for all of us. So the skin shares what it feels, for instance, and sends that information. It's available to all the other cells, and they do with it whatever they want. Like, for instance, if you get burned, then maybe certain cells in your body go overdrive to heal the skin or whatever. And it's the same way as like you discussing with a scientist, and they're trying to convince you that they're right. Maybe there is space for all of those beliefs, and just bridges for sharing, and which might enrich, or be useful to each other's sets of beliefs without having to shift those. And so the most important thing is, are you comfortable with your beliefs? And some people living in a scientific materialism kind of way are actually very comfortable with their beliefs, and I think they would go mad if they would try to switch to spirituality, um, because simply speaking, it's not the right belief for who they are, and that's totally fine. So I hope that was interesting as it's sort of addendum to the previous video, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.